There, can you tell me who you are?
Kyle Bagenstose, environmental reporter with the Bucks County Courier Times.
I'm Kristina Nasuti. I'm the investigative reporter for Burlington County Times.
And those two papers are linked together. You're both under the same ownership, right?
Yes.
Okay, very good. I'm Frank Brill, editor of EnviroPolitics, and we are here to interview put you on the other side of the fence for a change, interviewing you because of a story, or a series of stories actually, that you've been writing. Your paper has been covering, both papers, that have to do with contamination that's in the groundwater under the joint bases, Fort Dix, McGuire, and Lakehurst, and that has been leaking or traveling off the site, and we're going to get to that. Before we do, I'd just like to ask you both first a little bit of background. People are always interested in this. We'll start with Kyle on the left. Kyle, how long have you been in journalism? Where have you worked?
Well, I graduated Temple's journalism school in the spring of 2010, and more or less have been working in the industry for various publications since then. Patch.com, a magazine company, for a brief time. And I've been with Calkins Media, which owns the papers here, for about 3 years now, first as a daily reporter and now as the environmental reporter.
And what's your assignment here?
Kristina and I have been kind of working together on this story. The joint base, we were originally investigating some military bases on this side of the river in Warminster and Horsham, Bucks, Montgomery counties. And that story initially ran in February of 2016, so last February, and quickly became aware of the fact that there might be also an issue with joint base McGuire-Dix-Lakehurst. So Kristina kind of took the lead on investigating there, but we've been together looking at that over the past year or so.
And Kristina, your assignment, you're primarily with the Burlington.
Yeah, I'm primarily with Burlington County Times, but Kyle and I are part of the same investigative team. We're one of 6 or 7 on the team. I should know this off the top of my head, but I think it's 7. So there are 7 of us. Kyle is environmental, but I cover Burlington County, so anything and everything. But with this assignment, I mean, as Kyle had mentioned, this is something that has been on the radar since the Warminster reports. But 2016, May of 2016 was the very first story that we wrote about the Joint Base McGuire. And at that point, they've been well into their preliminary investigation at the Joint Base. So,
okay, great. Well, kudos to your newspaper for still putting resources into investigative reporting and environmental reporting. There are fewer of environmental reporters around these days. It's great to see it, and there's more need, from my point of view, to have environmental reporting. But at any rate, so let's get to the story at hand here. Now, what links the bases in Pennsylvania and New Jersey is the material that has leaked into the groundwater. Tell us a little about that material and why it was used in the bases in the first place.
Oh, I take that one?
Yeah, you can, yeah.
Aqueous film-forming foam, AFFF, as it's commonly referred to. That's a solution that military has been using going back probably 3 or 4 decades to put out oil fires, any carbon-based material fire for it. Water doesn't really do the job. It sinks to the bottom of water and actually becomes more volatile as it expands, as it starts to boil. So these foams used a product called PFOA, PFOS, originally developed by private industry, companies like 3M and DuPont, and basically put this into the solution. I don't want to get into too much of the science behind it, I don't think, but it blanketed the foam, the fires, and put them out. So the military has used these foams across hundreds of bases over the past 30 or 40 years. More often than not, they were used in training, not necessarily for emergency situations, but just regular daily use of the base firefighters would go out, practice using this foam, and more often than not, it seems in a lot of cases, it would be left to either go into the base's stormwater management system, which would then discharge into the environment, or sometimes just left onto the soil or the environment to make its way, through into the groundwater, infiltrating, run off into streams, whatever nature does with it. So
now, for people who are not familiar with the science and the chemistry, this material was also used. It was very popular in using at home in cookery and non-stick frying pans and things like that. So, and it's only been in recent years, I guess, that there's been a general awareness that it's dangerous. Certainly in the case like this, where it gets into the environment, into the groundwater. So I just wanted to be clear that the Army didn't necessarily know at the time they were using it that there was going to be a problem, or did they?
No, I think that has not been demonstrated that they had any knowledge of the dangers, the toxicity of this material. As I said, they've been used for decades, as you said, for many private applications, things like Teflon pans, stain-resistant clothing.
Sticky notes, the back of the sticky notes also contain the chemical as well, yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all kinds of applications. There have been some lawsuits against private industry that these companies had some prior knowledge going back into the 90s, 80s, that they were at least some level of concern about this. There has not really been any information, with very few exceptions, that the military shared those concerns. I think a lot of concerns came about post-2000, when a lot of research, released public research, started coming out about these chemicals and their potential toxicity.
So when did the Army or the military start to react or take any action on this?
Well, I'll talk about what I know generally, sure. And then Kristina can mention the joint base maybe. But yeah, I think looking at Warminster and Horsham as being two early examples, I think the military started to investigate there, or at least in some way, about 2011. That's the earliest kind of reference I can find to PFOA or PFOS being a concern there. Primarily looking at that base, I haven't looked at the literature from around the country too much, but I think it's about then. I would say, towards the 2008, 9, 10, 11, it started to hit the radar for the military, and they started, as I said, thinking about this, best I can tell, for this region around 2011. You want to talk about joint base? Yeah,
I believe for joint base, the investigation began around 2014, 2015. That's what the records have shown, the initial preliminary assessment. But I mean, just to kind of jump into the national look, and the military has been working to phase out the use of this foam, and they are actually limiting the amounts that they use for practices only. But they're trying to phase out the foam as we speak. I believe they spent about $16 million to try to replace the foam. But I mean, looking at joint base, their investigation began 2014-15. And since then, they have been going through their process. So they have each military base has a process that they follow. Right now, I believe we're still in the site investigation phase, and they have about six or seven more phases to go before this investigation is officially complete for them. Whether or not they're going to continue to monitor after the investigation is closed, that's something that we're going to have to determine and speak with them on.
I guess it depends on what they find.
Yeah, it does depend on what they find.
So is Warminster out ahead in terms of investigation?
Yeah, I would say so. I believe, they're basically a little further down the line. And what happened of interest in Horsham and Warminster is that in 2000, I want to say it was 13 was the original list, but then over the next couple of years, they implemented what's called a unregulated contaminant monitoring rule testing program. It's a lot of words, but basically what it does is there's a lot of unregulated chemicals that are out there. Every 5 years or so, the EPA will pick a list of a couple dozen that it uses the most potentially dangerous, and it will start a sampling program around the country to test for these chemicals. PFOA and PFOS, these chemicals in firefighting foam, made the list for the round that took place in basically 2014 and 15, and that identified high levels of contamination in the public water supplies near the bases here. So that kind of, obviously, the alarm bells rang that they need to deal with the situation. And I think the military, just at that time, after spending about 2 or 3 years starting to do some of the environmental sampling, was just getting around to thinking maybe we should sample these public water supplies nearby. So as I said, that process took about 3 years between when they first started looking and when the UCMR program, the EPA's program, rang those alarm bells. So and that was going back 2 years, but they're still looking at environmental media as well.
So why don't I ask each of you individually, what are the potential impact areas for Warminster and for the joint bases? And by the way, when we say joint bases, I think I said initially, but people may not be familiar with that term. That's an all-encompassing term that takes in Fort Dix and McGuire Air Force Base
and Lakehurst.
Yeah. Okay, in New Jersey. They're all Burlington County, and they pretty much abut each other.
It's Burlington and Ocean County. The largest portion of the base, McGuire and Dix, are in Burlington County.
All right. Well, since Pennsylvania had the lead here,
right. So yeah, the impact areas have been pretty well defined. We're still waiting to see. A lot of times, the military put together a plume map, a very colorful demonstration, easy to follow. This is where we know groundwater has been contaminated. I haven't seen that yet, but we know that in the 3 townships, Warminster, Warrington, and Horsham, they serve about 70,000 people with public water. Pretty much all those people were exposed in their water systems to varying degrees. So that's kind of the footprint, if you will, of the really high levels of contamination, water above the EPA's recommended health advisory. Surrounding townships, places like Hatboro, Northampton, to some extent Warwick, you've seen maybe some private well owners have it, and maybe a few public wells that are contaminated with levels below the EPA 70 part per trillion health advisory. But that's more or less the footprint. I would have to look at the map to know for sure, but it's a matter of miles, a mile or two from contaminated sites at the base to where the farthest contaminated wells have been found contaminated at the sense of above the EPA's health limit.
Well, that's quite an impact, potential impact anyway.
Well,
especially near the bases, it's amazing.
Yes, I mean there's not a lot of data to show. One of the things people in Pennsylvania are pushing for is a blood testing program to determine the extent of which they've been impacted. But I haven't seen anybody question the fact that at least in the neighborhood of 70,000 current residents had this in their drinking water at levels the EPA has now shut down those wells. So I think that's a definite. The question of the impact in terms of how high exactly were those levels when they were drinking it, how many people in the past, and what are the health repercussions of that, that's still up in the air.
And that 70,000 area, that was public systems. They were coming off what they called, city water, or were they, or were a lot of
those were public systems. The public systems, Warminster, Warrington, and Horsham, used groundwater wells for their water.
Oh, I see.
So they each had between, I think it was about 10 to 15 water wells each that would supply millions of gallons, I think, on a monthly basis. And the wells that were found to be contaminated above the 70 part per trillion limit have all been taken offline. So they've been taking other measures to pipe water in from neighboring companies, install filtration systems that can filter it, that sort of thing. But yeah, when the contamination was first found, they were groundwater wells that took water out of the aquifer, which these chemicals had polluted from the bases, and that's been the kind of water they've been drinking for decades since foam use began in the 70s.
And how about the joint bases, the impact there, potentially?
Well, the impact of the joint base isn't to the public water systems around the joint base, like in Pemberton, Lakehurst, aren't as great. We're looking at, the joint base has been focusing on the potable wells, so the private well owners. We have a lot more private well owners around the base, like in parts of Pemberton Township, Manchester in Ocean County, and Lakehurst Borough in Ocean County, and just north of the base in New Hanover. So those are where the private well owners are located, and that's where the joint base has targeted the testing. They did conduct tests of the Pemberton Township municipal water supply under the UCMR3, no detection there. Lakehurst was the same, although that well was not under the UCMR3 program. That was a testing that the joint base had conducted on their own. There were no levels that were found there. However, when we're looking at the private wells, we have 3 private wells that we know of right now that showed levels well above the 70 parts per trillion. Those residents, 2, I believe, are located in Lakehurst and 1 in Manchester. Actually, no, not Lakehurst, Jackson Township. Yeah, Jackson Township and 1 in Manchester. They have been provided with bottled water, and as far as I know, filtration systems have been installed in those homes. But there's only about a 50% response rate for private well owners. So we don't know how many others are out there that do have contaminated wells and that they're drinking from them, just because there is such a low response rate from these residents.
Let's talk about the response rate, because I was surprised to read that in one of your stories that what you mean by that is the military actually solicited, they notified homeowners nearby and told them that this could be a problem, and but 50% of them, as you say, just ignored it or never got the message or whatever.
Well, it's not ignored. I mean, there could be a number of factors here. I mean, we're talking about properties that are set back hundreds of feet. We're talking about abandoned properties. We're talking about properties that have fences and no trespassing signs posted on them. And then we're also talking about people who look at the letter, they get lost in the shuffle, and they kind of forget about it. So it could be a number of things. I mean, as far as I know, the military has, they have gone door to door. If nobody's home, they leave a letter, a permission slip, asking the resident, can we have permission to step onto your property to conduct the testing? They explain what's going on, and then they wait. As far as I know, they've done that 2 or 3 times. I'm not sure if they've done it again. To my knowledge, they have tried to reach out to the residents that have not yet responded more than once. But there's no telling to date how many other residents responded since we wrote the story back in March.
What kind of a response has your story elicited, either from readers or from public officials?
I mean, we get comments here and there. It's probably not as strong as the response from Warminster.
Well, I think we're still pretty early in the joint base in New Jersey of looking to see what potential impacts are there. I mean, like I said earlier, with the UCMR program, I mean, it was pretty evident as soon as they released those results and the word got around to the public that that tens of thousands of people have been exposed to this, and I think our coverage, a lot of the strength of it was kind of letting people know just what that meant. These are not familiar chemicals to people. It takes them time to even, begin to understand what the potential repercussions of this are. So in New Jersey, obviously, not having any kind of exposure at that level, there's going to be, less people who are concerned about it. But I think we're still early, as we just said. The testing program, needs to be completed. I think they're still trying to get a handle on where the contaminated water, especially the groundwater, has flowed to in New Jersey. So a lot of times they'll go out, they'll sample a home. If they get a high result, I think one of the homes had a result in, I think it was like 1,600 parts per trillion, which is the EPA's limit is 70. So the math on that is considerable. So typically what they'll do, if they have a high level there, they'll look and say, well, where does the groundwater from that point, where does that flow from there, right? So then they'll do a follow-up round of testing to try and, so they're going to go through that step-by-step process, I believe, to look at this. And another thing we're digging into too, which was the subject of our most recent story, was what potential past exposures have there been on the joint base. They, especially on the eastern portion, the Lakehurst side, predominantly use wells from the Kirkwood-Cohansey aquifers, which are shallow aquifers, very subject to contamination, sometimes as shallow as 15 feet deep, typically I think more in the 50 to 80 feet deep kind of range. The Joint Base has tested a lot of those on-base supplies. And the subject of our most recent report, as I said, was the fact that they found high levels of these chemicals in 2 of the wells that aren't being used currently, but historically our research found that they have been used to some extent over the past 10 years during certain portions of that time period, providing the majority of the water to a water system serving, I think, 3,000 people labeled as that. So, and that's only going back 10 years. These foams have been used since the 70s. So in terms of what people were exposed to previously, what levels, there's still a lot of unknowns in that way.
So the 3,000 people who did use this water at some point or other, they were I assume they were servicemen and women on the bases, but and beyond that, were there, I guess, public employees who work at the bases, and were there families of service people?
I mean,
who lived there too?
The 3,000 served is a combined residents, contractors that would come on the base, employees. I mean, most of the time, if you're living on the base, you're working on the base unless you're a family member or a child. So anyone that was using that water at that time could have been potentially drinking contaminated water. But there's nothing telling, other than pumping records and data that we collected recently, saying that they definitely have been drinking this water that has been contaminated for that long of a period.
Yeah. So a lot of states, and this includes New Jersey, will characterize their water systems by terms like community or transient or non-transient. They kind of to identify what kind of water system you're talking about. Is it just something where workers use it, or is it something where it's very seldomly used or used for an industrial purpose? So the system we're referring to is called the Hill system, and that's on the Lakehurst portion of the base. As I said, this is from the state records that it serves 3,000 people, and it's listed as non-transient community, which would mean you would expect that the people who are using that system are there on some kind of permanent or residential basis. So, from what we can gather from looking at the information that's available, yes, it would be serving personnel, as Kristina said, serving personnel who are living on the base, as well as anybody who's just there for a contractor or on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, there's a lot to this, and you've done some great work. And I have to point out the statistics you brought to bear in your stories is very impressive. And I think we're going to have to wrap it up here, though. We're in 21 minutes in. But what I'd like to ask you is just tell me this. A lot of people should be very interested in the work you're doing. Is there an easy way for them to access it?
Oh, I mean, everything, all of our articles that we posted about, both sides, Pennsylvania and New Jersey, are on BurlingtonCountyTimes.com. It's under our Unwell Water series. So if you go to the main page, news, Unwell Water, it's broken out in its own section, and everything is in front of our paywall. So it's easily accessible to everyone.
Okay, and it won't disappear after.
No, and we encourage, actually that's something that our company has decided to vote. Typically we have a 24-hour paywall on any stories, so they'll go up, they'll be on for 24 hours, and then you'll have to pay for them. The Unwell Water series, which covers all of our coverage in both sides of the river, Pennsylvania and New Jersey, as a company was decided to, as a public service, we brought in front of that paywall. So all of it's free and accessible. As Kristina said, we have a place on our website that should be pretty easy to find and access that has all of the stories as well as maps and frequently asked questions.
Well, certainly anyone who's ever had any history involved with the bases should be interested in following this as you go along. And like you said, it's not going to be resolved tomorrow. The results have to come in from the testing and so on and so forth, and then we'll see if more wells have to be closed down or if long-term health tests are going to be required. And a very interesting story. And thank you both not only for the reporting you're doing, but for giving me some time today to get it out to my listeners and readers.
Sure. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us.
Okay.